We're live.
Okay, hello. Um, I'm Daniel Bonham. I'm here today giving a plein air demonstration with gouache. The first things that I'll be doing is first talking about possible strategies for painting before we actually get the demonstration going. But you have the materials, which are oil, watercolor, Golden's open acrylic, casein, and then egg tempera or fresco. But egg tempera and fresco are not so portable, so we'll kind of just set those aside. But if you do oil paint, I would suggest purchasing good quality paint. If you don't, what happens is you start struggling with mixing the colors. Things don't have as much power. Mixing power is a good quality paint. Odorless thinner, if you're working inside. I use gum spirits turpentine, which has a odor to it. I have good ventilation. If I'm working in the wintertime, what I'll do is I'll open up the window or the door to outside for about 20 minutes every hour, and then I constantly have a fan going. The thing with the odorless thinner is that you can't smell it, but it still puts off volatile fumes. So you just want to keep that in mind, that the odorless thinner is not safe. It just doesn't smell. And then we have supports for oil paint. It would be gesso on paper, gesso on panel, gesso on canvas. You could also do an oil ground on canvas, but first if you're not vegan or if you're not conscious of what's going on in the world and animals, you could use a rabbit skin glue. If you don't want to use an animal product, you can use a PVA as the size that you put on the canvas after you've stretched it. Let that dry, and then you put 2 layers of the oil primer, and the first one will be a little bit thinner. Put that on, let it dry anywhere from a couple days to a week. Then the second coat you put on is a little bit thicker, and if you've never worked on an oil ground, it's quite beautiful. I've used white lead in the past. I no longer use that because I probably have a little bit too much in my system at this time, so I have to let it dissipate. But if you're careful, wash your hands, maybe drink a glass of milk before you use the oil primer or oil paint, just in case you accidentally ingest it. But I wouldn't suggest smoking or eating with oil paint on your hands. So just make sure if you're going to do that you wash your hands. Oil painting is flexible, allowing one to work wet into wet or wet onto dry. Then we're going to move on to water-based paints, which can be directly on unprimed or unsized paper. Watercolor, you would want it onto that bare paper rather than having some kind of size. Gouache, casein, you can work straight onto the paper, or you can put a gesso primer. You can also do a glue size if you like, or that PVA, which is like a glue. PVA is very similar to Elmer's glue, just has a slightly different composition to it. You can also, as you're kind of working with the gouache or the casein, but probably specifically to gouache, is you could take workable fixative, give it a quick, after the gouache is dried, give it a quick spray with the workable fixative, let it dry, go back in, and then the gouache will not interact with the gouache that's down below. So you can kind of have a nice kind of base color to it. And then, the one thing that you can do with watercolor is it's thin veils, where you're just kind of laying things down, building up slowly. You can also do a thing which is known as direct hits with the watercolor, which later on today I'll be giving a demonstration on ink wash, and you can actually do the same thing where it's a direct one-time hit, you leave it alone. I call this crystallizing with the paper, and this can happen with the watercolor, it can happen with the gouache. If you're working thinner with casein, it can do that as well. But what it is you lay it down, there's some kind of size either on top of the paper or it's in the paper as you're kind of working. So that size, it could be potato starch, it could be various things, but it's kind of active. So when you're actually working, it becomes part of the painting, and the watercolor or the gouache kind of interacts with it. And when I say crystallization, it just becomes like a mark that really is like its own thing and has a super kind of freshness to it. The thing, then you go to watercolor where you're kind of working with thin veils. You can do that, and you slowly build it up. So if we go back to that direct hit, you have this deep, rich tonal color. You lay it down. You can do the same thing with the layers. It's just it'll take you time. You'll have to let it dry. I have a friend that uses a hair dryer in between layers of his ink wash or his watercolor, and it gets down. But some people that I would suggest, an old master would be Winslow Homer. He's working with watercolor. He's also working with gouache, which is an opaque watercolor, and we'll get into the description of gouache in a moment. But Winslow Homer, he's doing the washes with the, in the late mid 1800s, somewhere in that vicinity. But specifically these Caribbean scenes where he's doing these indigenous people fishing or whatnot, and then you go up into New England, and this is the New Englanders fly fishing in canoes in the middle of the wilderness. It's quite wonderful. Then another guy, contemporary guy, Gary Spatz. He's had a show on PBS, and I think of all the watercolorists that I've seen, in the sense of teaching it, he's very good because he'll give you a step-by-step view of what's happening with the watercolor. And the amazing thing about him is that he'll do, laying these big washes, and it looks like a total abstraction. And then he'll flip the painting around, and all of a sudden it looks like a landscape. And the other thing that he does is he usually is the watercolorist on cruise ships, which, that's currently not happening, but that might be something if you obtain a certain kind of efficiency with the watercolor, you could always get on. And I think the idea is that when the ship is at sea, you have to give the lessons. When the ship is in port, you're just as everyone else is. You have a chance to go and sightsee if you want, but that's when he usually does his watercolor show. And there's also the I guess you would call it the Bible of watercolor. That's what it's titled as, but that has every kind of possible technique that you would want to do with the watercolor. And then we'll move on to gouache. Gouache is an opaque watercolor, and if you think of watercolor itself kind of being more of a English or British technique, and gouache more as a French or Italian. But there were, if you go back to the 1600s to say Rembrandt's time, there were people that were doing different colored inks. There was a Brist ink, black walnut ink, various other ones that you could do, and they would get these different kind of tonalities, and it would actually, because of the color of the ink, it would start looking like a watercolor, and they're quite amazing if you ever have a chance to see wash drawings from that time period. It's kind of like the very beginning of watercolor. But we'll get on to gouache. So it has honey in it for viscosity. Sometimes watercolor has it in it. It has gum arabic, and it also has a whiting, and that gives it the opaque quality of the gouache. So you can lay it down. You can have thin washes like watercolor. You can lay it down wet into wet, like oil paint. It really has that kind of quality. And then you could do wet onto dry. But every time that you touch the gouache painting with a wet brush, either just with water or with paint, it's going to change. So it's constantly morphing. And you have to remember that it's going to be different. It's kind of one kind of tonality when you're painting. When it dries, it becomes a totally different tonality. But as long as you maintain the relationships, it's going to maintain that same kind of thing. You could think in terms of if you're playing a piano and you start out at middle C and you play 3 notes and then you go 2 octaves up the piano, you play those same relationships of those 3 notes. What's going to change is the pitch and basically the value if you were working with color. Go back to middle C, go back down 2 octaves from middle C, and the tonality goes down. It's the same thing with painting, and I'm just mentioning it because gouache will have one tonality when you're working. It might be like a high pitched, and then it'll kind of come down, depending on the brand. So the particular gouache that I'm talking about is it's water-based. There's some modern gouaches or contemporary gouaches that actually have, it's more of like an acrylic base, so you're not going to get that same kind of ability to kind of mix the colors and go back in once the newer acrylic gouaches, they basically dry and they don't have an interaction with what's going on down below. But you can do it on unprimed, unsized paper. You can do it on gesso paper. I'd mentioned the workable fixative, but the whole thing is to let that paper kind of have an interaction with it. And then, let's see here, so gouache can have a feeling for being watercolor, or it can have that kind of a little bit of kind of what I call paint film to it. And as you're kind of working, it kind of comes up. As you're mixing the paint, the one thing that you want to be looking for is if it has a little bubbles in it as you're kind of mixing, and that seems to be once you've gotten past the state of laying in the first washes, it seems to be the state of how you start building it. So you build it up, you start to build a paint film to it, and that's the important thing with the gouache, because it starts to affect what's happening. In oil painting, in acrylic painting, the thing that is often mentioned is fat over lean. And what that means is that when you start out working, you want to be thin. You don't have to be too thin. If you go too thin, the paint will start, particularly oil paint, it'll basically disintegrate, and the pigments won't have anything to kind of act as their vehicle to make them adhere to the paper or to the painting surface that they're working on. But with the gouache, you can go fairly thin, and then you can only go so thick, and then it'll start cracking. And remember, it's on a piece of paper, so if you bend the paper like this and the paint is on this side, it could feasibly crack, but you'll figure that out. The first time you have a painting crack, you'll like pull back from doing that. And then let's just talk about Golden's open acrylics. I've been working with acrylics probably since the late 60s, and it always has this feel of this plastique where you can't transcend the paint, and it's just what the materials were at that time. And I would keep trying it every decade. It's like, what's happening? Is this going to work? Finally, I came across Golden's open acrylic. I'm sure other brands have a similar kind of thing, but what it does is it has a vehicle in there that allows it to stay wet longer. So then you can actually work it the way that you would work oil paint, where it's not going to dry so fast. So it's wet into wet. You can go back, it's dry, you can go back and work it a little bit. But it just has a real kind of quality. The only problem with it is you have to pay attention to the thinness of it. They have on the back, they'll have like a little scale, super thin, super opaque, and you want to try to get as close to the opaque quality of those Golden open acrylics as possible. Otherwise, you're going to be working here and it's going to be so translucent that you won't be able to see what you've laid down, or it won't act as getting that kind of plastique quality of where you have that paint film and it lets you kind of see the surface. And then we'll talk about casein. It's a milk-based paint, so its vehicle is, if you imagine cottage cheese. You dry it, you crush it up, and then you mix it with some, I think it's gum arabic is in there, and then there's some specific casein mediums. I can't off the top of my head, I can't remember what they are, but that is something that you can work thinly with. You don't want to go too thinly. When I first started working with it, the main reason why I was working with it was that when my son was born, we didn't want to have oil paint fumes in the house, and so I started working with the casein. And I worked really thin like I did with gouache and like I did with watercolor, and sometimes starting out really thin with the oil paint. And so I would let it dry, come back the next day or later, and the moment I touched the brush, everything that I put on there where the brush had hit had totally dissolved. So I figured out pretty quickly that you needed to work a little thicker from the beginning. But it's a wonderful medium. It can be a little picky, but there's actually a Casein Society of America, which you know, if you want to have things, but you know, these people doing super realistic things, I'm not so interested in that. But if that's your cup of tea, you can go check it out. But so you kind of lay it down. It's acting like gouache in some ways, where it's kind of interacting. There's a medium, you know, the Casein medium. I've never used it. I just use it with water and kind of work around it and build it up to get that paint film that I talked about. Then what you can do is you can actually, if you want to, you can start making it thicker and thicker and get an incredible impasto, which you can find with the acrylic paint or with the oil paint, particular mediums, that'll, if you add to the paint, to the oil paint, it won't cause it to crack, but you know, you can get something like this thick come off the surface. And the other thing is that you can, once it's dried, let's say for a month, it becomes waterproof. You can't go back in and you can't work it. But the really beautiful thing about it is after it's dried for that month, go in with a soft cloth and you can buff it, and it has a nice, so it's been kind of maintaining a matte surface. Now all of a sudden it has this kind of shiny surface, which takes on a different quality. And then, you know, if you strategize correctly, as in oil paint, as in acrylic, not so much in gouache because it always kind of has this matte quality to it, but you can strategize to control how the light in the gallery is coming onto the painting by the way you lay down the paint. And that's quite fun, so that you can make it so that your painting always has good light regardless of where it is in the gallery and how it's lit. So then, you know, today what we're going to be doing is gouache paint, and as I mentioned, it's a very pliable, mixable medium, and I, in the past, have been known as Mr. Gouache, but I'm not taking that title. It's been given to me by my friends, because I would just like do these gouache paintings, and they would always comment, well, these look like oil paintings, and I'm like, well, they're gouache. You know, it's just, I guess I figured out a way how to kind of do that. But so we start here, and we have these little Arches watercolor pads. They're attached all the way around. I think this one might have fallen apart, so I just have it glued or taped to the back. But if we take our palette knife, I'll just show you. So you do your painting, you let it dry, you come here, and I don't know if you can see this little edge right there. But basically what you do after it's dry is you just come around like this. And it's better to do it with a palette knife or something so that you don't tear the paper. And then voila. Well, okay, voila too soon. But you come around here and you have it, and voila, the piece is out. So that's a good thing to know. The other thing you can do is, I mean, some people will do this where they'll just put a piece of tape in each corner. It really depends on what your preferences are and what you want to happen. What I find, you know, I might add another piece of tape over here and up here. But what I found is that I tend to work very wet with the gouache, so the paper is going to warp. These are, I think, 140-pound paper. The current designation of that is where the new measurement is called 300 grams, and all that has to do is how much does a certain stack of the paper together weigh, and that's how they come up with the particular thing. Now this is you know, the way that I usually do it, where I'm taping it all the way around, and I'm using some kind of, you know, edge. Sometimes I'll sit there and measure it out, sometimes I won't. I just put the the tape down. But the reason why I'm doing this is it's keeping it down the whole time. I mean, literally, if I turn it aside, sometimes the paper will warp this much off the paper or off the board. So you want to kind of keep that in mind. The other thing that it does for you, if you were going to frame it, you have this white area that you can frame it, and you're not going to lose a piece of the painting in the process. But that's what is it? Oh yes, and then we'll just give you like a little demo. I did this for a painting one class, probably around early 2000s when I was up in Boston. But I mean, this is basically just a 20-minute kind of sketch, and it's talking about how to lay things in, and you know, not picking things over. You notice there might be a little bit of indication of what the ellipse is, the form, big broad shapes, and that's the way I would suggest that you start a painting if you're first starting out. That's one thing, is just be very simple about it. Get the shapes down. Try to cover the whole surface at first so that you have something to work with. The other strategy that you might want to think about is how you're going to set up in the landscape. The other thing that you might want to consider first is what kind of clothes are you wearing in the landscape. I always wear something like this depending on how hot it is. I might roll my sleeves up on a hot day, and then if you'll see my funny hat on top, I'm wearing two hats, but I usually wear a big broad hat like this so that I can keep the sun out. I don't like wearing sunscreen, but I will wear it out if I have to. But if I'm keeping myself covered, then I don't have to do that. I'm going to be a little silly for a minute, okay? So if you're in a field, I was in a landscape painting residency in France, summer of 2018 in Lyon, Brittany, France, through the Maryland Institute College of Art. It was the Alfred and Troford Klotz International Program for Artists, but we were there for 2 months painting, and that was fairly intense because we would get up at 7 or 8 in the morning, breakfast, go out and paint, come back for lunch, go out and paint, come back for dinner, and go out and paint until 11 at night. And it was great fun. It was very tiring, but you know, I wasn't going to have an opportunity like that, so I really took advantage. If any of y'all have the opportunity to do that, I would, highly recommend that you apply for that program. They're mainly looking for landscape painters, but they make adjustments, and you can adjust your statement when you write it to them. But so if you just kind of look at my legs, down here with the socks, so I'm being silly, but there's a real practicality to it. So you can purchase clothing with bug repellent in it. Or, if you're going out into the fields, high grass, do this. It looks funny, but, you're not going to have ticks on yourself or other biting bugs. The other thing you can do, this is rather personal, but you could bathe with lemongrass soap or with lavender soap and even do your hair, and that'll act as a bug repellent. So this is just, kind of maintaining kind of health protocols. But so anyway, so we'll look at the palette. If it's raining or if it's super sunny, I have this Julienne umbrella, which is quite nice. And if it happens to start raining today, we can all get under this. But it's it's adjustable, so you can, wherever the sun's coming from, it's great fun. And we'll just pull it down because we don't want to wish bad luck on ourselves for today. And I thought we were going to be inside, and I didn't know what I was going to do. But we'll just come to look at, I'll start painting in a second, but it's, rather than doing a full painting, I'm just going to show you like certain techniques of kind of how to set it up. But this is the way I set up my palette. We have white over here, yellow, we have 3 kinds of blues. It's a cobalt, I don't have the ultramarine on there right now, but it will, a violet. If we're doing landscape painting, sometimes I'll add 3 or 4, sometimes up to 8 different kinds of greens, so I don't have to sit there and mix them all. And then we've got the cadmium, or in gouache it would be known as spectrum red, and then the burnt umber. I don't use black, There's nothing wrong with that. I just chose early on when I was like 19 to not use black. And the way that I kind of get my black is I go with ultramarine and the burnt umber. And it, at times you really can't tell. But sometimes throw red in there when I'm mixing it. There are other people that will put their white dead in the center, have the cool on the left and the warm on the right. So I would suggest two different kinds of yellows, two different kinds of reds, two different kinds of blues, and basically the burnt umber and the white. If you were working in oil paint, there's titanium white. I wouldn't use zinc because it acts as a brightener, but it also, what's being discovered is that it's not stable, so it can kind of start falling apart or cracking. If, once again, as I'd mentioned before, if you wanted to use a lead white for oil painting, I'd recommend either flake white or Cremnitz white. But once again, you want to be careful. Try not to get it onto your hands. If you're using those lead whites, drink milk before, during, and after, because if you accidentally ingest it, the milk will help you pass it without it getting into your system. Normal heavy metals like cadmiums and whatnot, they don't leave your system once they get in. They just keep building up. So you just have to be mindful if you're using oil paint to do that. And then, I have my little mini French easel here. It's an Italian version. The French ones, the Juliennes, have little brass bars that come out that have a kind of crook thing that will hold the panel for you. And then when I'm painting, because I've been out in thunderstorms and high winds, things will go flying. I use a bungee cord. You can adjust it to kind of fit. Usually if I'm working in oil, I have a palette that's about this wide on it, and it's quite fun. Oh yes, and then we'll put the cap on again because we don't really need the hat at this moment. Just one other kind of helpful thing. Do we still have time?
Yeah.
Okay. Is that if you're traveling, you want to have some kind of label on your materials, and you'll have to have these checked, and you can't bring them on board. But you want to have something like your name. You want to tell them what it is. In this case, it's Artist Water-Based Pigment Wash, Opaque Watercolor, Non-Flammable, Safe for Travel. If you don't do that, and they see it in there, they might very well take it away from you, and where you might be traveling, the materials might be far more expensive than where you're coming from. I kind of experienced that when I went to France. I forgot a couple of colors, and I paid the price for that. But so what we'll do now is we'll just do a quick demo. You need your little jar of water. If you wanted to, you could, probably should have taken the label off of it, but a little jar of water, at the most maybe a 32-ounce plastic, used plastic yogurt container, because sometimes, depending on your sensibility and how you want to work, the water might become a little too muddy. So if you could just think of the water as you're cleaning your brush, that's one aspect of it. The other aspect is that it's the medium that you're using to work with it. So we'll just start off. I mean, I haven't laid out any paint yet, but we'll just take the cobalt and we'll mix it. I mean, this is going to be very thin, but with the gouache, the one thing I would say is just start with as bright a color as you can. Don't worry about mixing it down, because as you work, it's going to change. And then we can just kind of lay it here. I'm not going to do a scene or anything. I'm just going to get these things to kind of lay down a little bit. But, as I'm kind of doing this, so the strategy, you're choosing your motif. If you're out in the landscape, I mean, I think of, still life, landscape, figure, portrait. I think of them all very similar. They're not the same, but a lot of times, if you look at, say, Cezanne or Morandi, people will say or mention that Morandi's landscapes or Cezanne's landscapes look like still lifes. And then they'll say, conversely, his still lifes look like landscape, which is interesting because I think what they're really saying is that it's kind of talking about the scale and the relationship, if you will, of humans to kind of what they're looking at. And it's quite amazing. But so we just kind of do this. We'll lay down some more stuff. We're going to have to let it kind of, I might have to pull out some actual paint. This is all dried, and you can actually leave it on there, and then it reactivates. If it's, depending on the brand that you're using, it might dry and not come back up. And what we'll do, we'll just get it more intense. And I'm going to lay out some of this color so we can kind of see it. So there's not much difference between that, but we were able to obtain a little bit of difference. Now we'll just water it down really very much. And you know, for me, the thing I see is that when I first start a painting, it's very abstract, and it sometimes can stay abstract for a while, and then you kind of coax it onto or out of the page to get it to do what it wants to do. But you know, for me, it comes down to we have a notion of what things look like, and then that's one reality, and then we have the reality of what things actually look like. And the thing that, you know, most people don't want to think about or haven't thought about is the act of looking and seeing is a very abstract thing, and you just kind of have to maintain that as you're working, because it's so easy to put in so much information right away, but then you kind of lose the spirit of what you're actually trying to do. And you know, as you start out as a painter or as an artist, you'll you know, the idea is you try to replicate what you're looking at, because that's, you know, how you kind of assess as to what are you doing what you need to do, or can you see what you do. And then there's the other aspect: are you able to kind of interpret it or have a personal relationship with what it is that you're looking at? And that's when it becomes interesting. And do you transcend yourself, and do you transcend the subject or the motif that you're working? And lastly, and probably more importantly, do you transcend yourself? And that's the thing that I would kind of propose. You know, as humans, we have certain kind of ideas of things, but you know, we have limitations, but we can transcend ourselves and go beyond what our abilities are. So then we'll just kind of come in. I'll just put a little bit of this. Well, maybe that was actually cobalt there. Oh, yeah, it was cobalt. Anyway, it's not important for our purposes. But so you have your. Let me just get some more paper towels. So you want to have your little paper towel, or you could have a soft cloth if you wanted, and you can use it to, if you go in, I mean, this is watercolor or ink wash drawing. You come in, you don't want so much on there, you just do this, and then it just becomes a little bit of, or less, if you will. So now we're going to build up the paint just a little bit. Come over here. Let's do it over here, and we'll just kind of lay it. Okay, so right here it's interacting. You can kind of see that interacting. And what we'll do, I mean, I could actually just take that off and you'll see that it's really interacting there. So you have to let the gouache dry a little bit. But we'll just get a little bit more paint film on there. And the thing to remember is you're very washy at first with it. And then as you kind of move along, if you want to add in details, and I think of details as like a personal choice. It's like how much detail you want to put in. But the thing is, the relationships of things, it becomes, you know, a particularness of something or a specificity. That's where you're going to get your information, rather than putting in all these little details, because the relationship is what's telling you what's happening. And if you think in terms of the light in a landscape or a setup or in a painting, the light is going to inform everything. And what the light informs what the form is. The light informs what the color is. The light informs the space. It informs the relationship. Is it lighter or darker tonality as you're kind of working? So we'll just kind of lay this down here like that, and you can kind of see it. We'll bring in a different color. so that you can kind of see that it's kind of mixing. So this is dry, and you would think normally paint, if it was oil paint, it was dry, it wouldn't do anything. But if you come here, so then you can see that it starts kind of intermixing with that. And so just keep in mind that every time that you touch something, it's going to interact with it. Now, to kind of jump forward for a second, and then we'll come back for a second. There's an egg emulsion in, I think, Reed Kay's Materials and Methods book, and also Ralph Mayer, where you can actually lay this, it's like a varnish on top of the gouache. The only thing is that it creates kind of hot spots. So if you have like a washed in area and a thicker area, the thicker areas will take on a kind of shiny hot spot quality when you take that photograph. Now, as you move along, let's say that this was a landscape and everything's kind of built up, and there's that paint film quality that I talked about. When you go in now, what you want to do is you want to, as you move along, it's not as much water, it's not, or medium for our purposes, but you can actually start controlling what happens to it by not having as much water in there. So we can come in here, and it's actually laying on top. This is still wet, it may not work, but we can come on here. Okay, so it's kind of interacting a little bit. Let's come down here where I put it on. So that's kind of laying there, and you can do that if it doesn't have a lot of water in it. The other things that you might want to consider for gouache, once again, thinking of that modern gouache that's more like acrylic, you could put a touch, just like in a container like this, you could put a touch of matte or gloss acrylic medium in there, and that would be something that would give it a little bit more permanency, where it wouldn't interact so much. If you wanted a little more viscosity, what you could do is you have your one jar that you mix, and you're kind of swishing your brush around and trying to clean it. And then you have your other one that's just a clean jar of water, and you're using it like a medium, so you're not trying to get the paint in there. And then that way, when you go to like do those later on touches, it'll really help you to kind of get that paint to lay on top, and it won't settle in. And I believe, as I mentioned earlier, another possibility is you're kind of doing you can do a workable fixative spray on top of it and let it dry, let the gouache painting dry, then you spray it with a workable fixative, and then you work on top of it, and it interacts a little bit. Sometimes, depending on how many layers, you can actually create a barrier. I'm trying to think of this modern American painter that did the Saturday Night Review. Can't think of his name. But anyway, he would, this is awful. But anyway, what he would do is he would do his underdrawing, and then he would shellac it, and then he would let that dry, and then he would paint on top of it. If he had issues with his drawing or painting, he could wipe it out and not lose the drawing. Where conversely, when I started painting, I would do like this meticulous drawing of everything, showing where the light was and everything. And I found out like I was being caged, and I couldn't get out of it. I felt obligated to stay within those lines. It's like a coloring book.
Yeah.
So now when I work, I just basically do very minimal drawing, lay in the shapes, and they may not be correct at first. And then I just slowly keep working, and maybe things come together and things are proportional in a relationship, and then things will fall apart really quickly, and then you kind of keep working. There's a great book by James Lord. It's a portrait of Giacometti, and what Giacometti's doing is a painted portrait of James Lord. And what James Lord is doing is, I think it was over 16 sittings, which were anywhere from 3 to 6 hours. And, it's probably over like a year or so, because Giacometti had to run back and forth for shows and whatnot. Yeah. But he has the photographs of the different stages, and where it's there, you can see it. The next session, everything's all whacked out. And, and then it kind of, keeps fluxing. And that's, you know, the important thing to kind of remember is that at least one thing that I've kind of learned as I've gone along, the more willing you're able to leave things open-ended, the better off you are. If you start nailing them down, you can very well fall flat on your face very quickly.
I think we are gonna finish up there, and then Dan is going to be doing another demo at 12:45, and we will try to live stream that.
Okay, thank you.